Thank you very much. I might be an experienced moderator, but I'm not at all an expert in your topics. But sometimes that's not the best idea to engage somebody who doesn't understand too much about the topics, because then I do ask the silly questions and you give the intelligent answers. We want to make it not all too long. On the panel, of course, you should have the possibility to ask all the questions you haven't raised so far, or let's see, coming out of our panel. I'm not going to introduce Karl because he had yesterday already a workshop, and he is going to be the closing speaker after the panel, after the coffee break. So excuse me, Karl, that I'm not going into more details.
It's okay, they'll get enough of me later.
Great. But of course, since you haven't spoken so far today, I want to go back to the question actually Alina raised at the end of her speech. She said, okay, and all of you said so far, the users don't know what they want, or they don't know really what they expect, so let's be ethical. Karl, what does that mean? What does it mean to be ethical?
As a Canadian who was raised as a Lutheran, I probably have certain perspectives on that are not really applicable here. I think that what it means to be ethical comes back in many ways to what Stephanie said this morning. That is not about dictatorship, but is about being a servant. It is not about leading in a certain way, but leading in another way, where we are trying constantly to recognize our ignorance of the situation, that we are not the person that we are ultimately designing for, and that we need to continuously developing tools and approaches and methods to develop empathy, to develop understanding, and that there is no real answer here in many ways, but there is much more of a path and a process and a mentality that we have to go through.
Well, that's not very concrete. So I'm going to ask Stephanie.
Oh, you're coming to me for concrete.
Yes, absolutely, because you're the one who said in your speech,
yeah.
The behavior is very important, and actually you find out about the behavior and about quality and about users' need by talking to the customers. So it's much easier for you to find out what the ethical perspective of the users is going to be. Can your method be adapted to the others who can talk really to people?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of three things. First, the talking is the observation of what people do is also a little bit what Matthias can get from the data. We see what happens. We see people have used this or clicked on that or done this or worked there. It's what people do. For me, you were mentioning also it's not an either or, and for me that's really true, because actually the interviews and the kind of qualitative, and sometimes it's direct interviews, sometimes it's indirect by actually getting to know people for a seemingly other process, but you also get to know them, is to not only see behavior, but to understand the mindset behind the behavior, which for me, so far in my experience, has been difficult to get from data. You see a lot of what is done, what happens, facts, but you don't necessarily understand the motivation, the motif of people behind what they do and why they do something like that. Because you can easily get two people that behave the same way for totally different motivation. And for me, that's really interesting to get. And so far, the only way I know how to get that is by talking to people. And then the other kind of nuance to this is, of course, that when people don't know what they want, for me, it's not enough to assume for them, because we are also human beings and you can't know for sure. So then we have to ask the right questions to be able to help them figure out what they want. And when they do figure out what they want, where is the line, and I don't have an answer to that, but where is the line between just kind of facilitating what they now know they want, or facilitating something that is better? What if what they want is actually harming themselves or other people? Where is our role as designers or architects or any type of facilitator to say, okay, we now understand you want to do this, Do we just help them do it? Do we say, no, you can't? Where is that ethical position in our roles to say, well, we know better? That for me is the kind of really interesting question. And after we do help people figure out what they want, what do we do with that?
Okay, so Alina, what is the answer to this question?
Yeah, I was exactly thinking while Stephanie was talking. I mean, I'm a bit of a fantasy person, or rather, I was almost thinking that who knows, maybe in the future, when there is even every year there is more and more information, and especially since all the companies are consolidating and kind of becoming monopolists in a certain way, maybe in the future there will be some kind of design audit or some kind of information audit. But again, that's also defined by humans. So it's hard to say, but maybe there will be a set of rules or guidelines somewhere out there, some manifesto to be guided with what is acceptable and what's not. That could be one option.
Well, but you all give the black Peter, der schwarze Peter, as we say in German. You say you say, okay, it's not really our responsibility. Maybe it has to be a board. Maybe it has to be somewhere.
No, it is our
know.
responsibility.
It is our responsibility.
Okay,
I never
but
said
how
that.
do you take your responsibility? What is the responsibility of a designer?
I think, I hope we can all say that we're all decent people, but then I have to mention that there's also business goals, right? And as a designer, I mean, I still work, I'm ethical, but I still work for a company. It's up to me, I think, as a decent person also to stand up and say, in some ways, this recruiting thing seems like a human shopping cart, So maybe we should, kind of be a bit, careful here. So it is our responsibility. But as we know, not all humans are perfect. So that's when I think we might need some regulations.
Before we come to the regulation, I want to ask you, Matthias. I mean, you said, especially in real estate, there is this question of we also want to do business. And we have not only our clients, but you have a boss as well. You have the huge real estate guys who say, we don't really care about ethical behavior, just bring us the potential clients.
Yeah.
So, no ethical space for your business.
This is a really nice point now. I really don't like this discussion. Let me concretize this, because we talk here about as if we would have a choice. As if we would have a choice in we only pick the tools we feel comfortable with, or which support us in our strive to become some strange ideal of humankind, whatsoever. Fact is that we as humanity, we almost wrecked this planet. I mean, we have climate change, we have overpopulation, we have refugees.
Violence.
For the first time now, this is a generation in Europe where our generation is going to have a shorter life expectation than the generation before. Or we have our education is worse. So this is this tipping point. This is nothing that's out of nowhere. So there were these predictions. Science predicted this tipping point. So if you read about the Club of Rome or Malthus, or if you go further back, so this strange strive for growth got to its limits. And now we are here, and we need to make sense out of it. And we need to help people. So if we go now into medicine, I really like medicine as an example, because it's a highly complex system. You get a treatment, you get new pharmaceutical products, and then we do a DNA test before and afterwards. And we do this with everybody. And then we find out more problems in those drugs, and we can customize those drugs much better. And with our blood probes, we can prevent others from dying. Wouldn't it be our obligation now to give away our blood, to give away our data? Don't we get this new way of digital citizenship where we need to contribute in order to improve humanity?
But you don't.
we don't, we do a lot. Because now what we do is, it's just like this Robin Hood attitude, we get all of this data from the industry, we show them how to improve, how to get better ratings and how to improve the valuation of the apartments. But what we do is, we do a better market fit. And then we have this freemium product, and with the money we get from the industry, we create new science, and we give it away to the people for free. Well, our advantage is that by doing this, we distort the market to our advantage. We can resell the product. So this is a different way of treating with results or truth.
Karl, you agree?
Oh, well, there's a lot there, so I don't know if I can say that I agree in a very simple way, because nothing that we are talking about here has a very simple answer. I was recently reading a story. It is recently the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And it turns out that that story is much more complex, because Luther himself does not actually remember putting the theses, nailing them to the wall. It was actually much, much different. But what happened in that was that we changed the way and where we look for truth. It began a process where we looked for truth when we said what would be true, what would be good, what would be ethical. We had a very specific answer, at least in the West, where we would say, we look to God, right? We look to the Bible. And what has happened in the last 500 years is we have kind of switched all this around. We have said, well, we do not necessarily look for that answer there. We look to ourselves. Even if we go to church, we are still deeply humanist. And so we feel that human beings are the ones who have to make many of these kinds of decisions, and we are the source of our own truth and what is good and these various kinds of judgments. And of course, human beings are very fallible creatures. We are constantly struggling to figure things out. And so I cannot say, yes, this is good. I cannot say, yes, I completely agree. But I cannot say I disagree in that sense either. There is so much to unpack there. And I think that we have changed fundamentally. You said that we are maybe at a tipping point, right? That we are at a change. We are moving into a new way of thinking about the world, about our understanding in the world, about how we are related to each other, and what we are as a species, as a society, as a civilization we are moving towards. I can't say that we are at a tipping point because we have said that before, but it does feel, with artificial intelligence and computation at this global scale, that it is more likely to be true now. And if it is true, and it is true the way some people think, right? Elon Musk said with artificial intelligence that we are summoning the demon. And I think that phrase is very evocative, and I would modify his phrase to say we may be summoning the demon, but it is perhaps, hopefully, still within our power to change that so that we are not. And so I believe that, because if I cannot believe this, then I would be extremely depressed. I believe that it is still within our power to make the choices that will guide us in maybe not good directions, but better directions.
So would that mean, I mean, you also mentioned, Alina, in your talk, you said, and not only you, take a step forward and improve your user needs with anticipatory and smart data. So this anticipation, and all of you mentioned it in some way, this anticipation in users' needs, should that become more with the ethical aspect, or again, are the payers the one telling you what the anticipation means?
You're asking me, right?
All of you.
Wow. I think the reason why we're using more anticipatory data to start with is because there are just, like we started this conference, there's just so much information and just so many products. So anticipatory data is meant to resolve this cluster, basically, and also because we can, you know, so that's why we do that these days. Because 5 years ago, we had other struggles, you know, we had everything going mobile, we had different technological curve. Right now, from what it looks like, it's about artificial intelligence and, of course, anticipatory data. About ethical, I think we're going in loop here now. As I said before, I still think it's for us as being decent human beings, and it applies not just to design or architecture, it's about anything to me. So I just think, and like you said, Karl, it's about continuing to keep this truth in ourselves and just, not abusing others. That's, for me, the answer is like that.
Stephanie?
I think we have a choice, and I think the people that are paying the bills, for me, they don't come first at all. For me, it's really about, what kind of future do we want to create here? And the user needs, for me, are also only part of that. It's not just about that. It's about what kind of future are we creating? And then, one of our clients is actually the government, and they don't even have a vision for their own city. It's a municipal government. And what happens is, what's happening with many of us is things move really quickly. We're not used to that. So especially in governments, the speed is like deadly. And what happens is they become in a reactive mode. And then what are they reacting to? They're reacting to the parties that are doing things because they can, or to the parties that are doing things because it's in their interest to do that. And people are the same. So there was an experiment, we talk about the future of cities, and what you see is all of those beautiful, shiny renderings with flying cars and autonomous driving and electric and this and that. Most of these are actually being put out there by car companies. So essentially...
Or by real estate companies.
Or by real estate companies. Essentially, those specifically, the ones that are coming, for example, from car companies, they're looking at a future where they can still ensure product placement. That is a very clear interest. So that's the kind of business aspect. And then what ends up happening is that governments look at those and have to react. And the only way they can react is rules and regulations, and they either allow the autonomous driving cars on the highways or they don't. And it's all of that. And nobody is actually stopping to think, besides all of what we can, what do we want?
So actually, if you say not even your government knows what they want, so this idea of regulation is useless.
Yes, for me it is, because it's coming also, what happened is, it's kind of the additive design, right? Do you know why the black cabs in England have their shape? Do you know why they're so high? Because when they were designed, people used to wear top hats. Nobody wears top hats anymore. The cars are still like that. We carry those features and nobody corrects them. And what is really actually scary is that when you talk to people, we had a project where we asked people to design their perfect street. Very simple. Everybody drew their own street with lots of trees and no cars. You ask people, where are your cars? They're in the neighboring streets. So even people are not able to preserve the interest of people as a community. So who is supposed to do that?
Okay, Matthias, you said a very philosophical, you had a very philosophical speech after your speech. Do you agree that a regulation or a regulatory board is needed? And would you find the right people for this board?
Yes. Totally. I mean...
Who?
I think in Europe it would be like a board of 350 million or so.
Okay.
Yeah, because this needs to be totally crowdsourced. So, although we always say this is the machine, it's not the machine, this is just some code working, and it's our data. And for the first time now in ages, everybody has the chance of having a proper impact, just by creating a record of its behavior. And therefore you have an impact. This is the democratization of knowledge, what we are facing at the moment. It's not the authority of machines. It is us, the people, who suddenly have an effect. And what we do is we get rid of those intermediate managers, of architects, of strange decision makers, of this middle management. Nobody really knows what you're doing anyway.
And you really believe that this is going to happen?
I think there are two ways we can go now from here on. Either this is happening or the other thing. And what Einstein said is, then we fight with sticks and stones. I don't see anything intermediate. I mean, we have really, there are proper problems nobody talks about. I mean, automotive engineering, self-driving cars. So we don't need cab drivers anymore. We don't need trolley drivers. Everything is going to be automatized. We're getting rid of the workforce now with a speed unseen before, and we have the Industrial Revolution already behind us. we have the problems in medicine, but it's not really problems, it's like there's a division, it's the scissor opens, so we have DNA modification with CRISPR on the one hand, but we have antibiotic resistance on the other hand. So there's a big gap.
But actually, you are the experts. You
I'm
know
the expert.
exactly what's happening.
Yeah.
I mean, you know about the smart data, you know about the behavior, you know about the users'
Yeah.
needs, not knowing what they really need. So you are actually the one who should stand up.
I do.
You do?
I always say that we need to share data. We need to find a new way of treating this stuff responsible. This is also why we established this workflow of doing architecture analysis in the cloud, because only when it's in the cloud it's going to be accessible for everybody. We have so cool PropTech startups here in Switzerland. I'm a big fan, for example, of Archaeologic. They came up with this idea of 3D.io, and what it is it's a new data format for architectural data just for the web in order to be able to share and communicate it much faster. And then we can close the gap, I think, because it's about communication. It's about rendering everything transparent, and not just how it looks, but also what it does.
Is this, I mentioned it before we started the panel, I mean, most of you have a very interesting cultural background. I mean, you were born in Lebanon.
Raised, yeah.
And raised.
Pretty
you
much.
studied in the States and you're working in Amsterdam. You are coming from the east of Europe.
Letland, yeah, Latvia. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
And are working in Spain for a German company. You are Canadian, working in the States. You are boring, you're an Austrian living in Europe.
Well, I was researching at the Future Cities Lab in Singapore.
Okay.
That's something.
Is this, I want to stay a little bit or for another minute with this ethical question. Is there a cultural difference when we talk about ethical aspects?
Definitely, and it's always for me, I try to adapt because as you said, I work for a German company, but sometimes when I propose something, I actually get to hear, no, that's a bit intrusive and that's a bit dipping into privacy. And I personally, I don't really understand, I don't really see it that way, you know, it definitely exists. But I don't know the answer of how this should be regulated.
Karl?
I really don't.
Well, as you mentioned, Canadian living in the United States. Some of you may have heard a bit about, say, the United States healthcare situation and are familiar with the way that they treat healthcare. And so to the question of whether or not there are cultural differences, then yes. I mean, coming from Canada, you know, and I think like many of you in Europe, there is this idea that healthcare is about a universal right. It is a right of humanity. It is something that comes with citizenship. It is not something that comes with your job. It is not something that is about whether or not you can afford healthcare. And in the United States, there is a very different idea. Healthcare is very much about consumer goods and services. It is a lot more like, say, batteries or haircuts. It is not something that is like freedom of speech or the right to vote. And so, many ways, there is sort of there is not a lack of interest in healthcare. There is not a lack of interest in healthcare getting better. But there is a very significant difference there. And I think that there is not necessarily an ethical difference in some ways, but another way, right, in the sense of, oh, healthcare is bad or healthcare is good. But there is very much a difference in terms of how do we get there? How do we get to a place where it is better for everyone? And so Matthias was very pessimistic, I would say, in terms of there is either essentially two paths, right? Either it all works out this particular way, or it all goes to hell and we have sticks and stones. I am more optimistic. I'm more optimistic generally in terms of human ingenuity, but I also tend to believe a great deal in diversity of ideas and diversity of thought, diversity of possibilities, and exploring those possibilities. Complexity theory has a lovely phrase that they use. It is called the adjacent possible. And so a lot of complexity work, one of the questions that they asked was applying it to evolution and how did evolution happen? So you take the example that is often raised about the eye. How did the eye evolve from a single cell that could detect light to the eye? And it's quite a question. And what they've worked out is that it's not that evolution created an eye, evolution has actually created at least half a dozen different eyes. It has happened multiple times, and all of those eyes are somewhat different in different species. So we can classify them in different ways, in different evolution. And when they talk about the adjacent possible, they talk about the path from that single cell to the eye. And what happens is we say, we do not go from here to the eye, from the cell to the eye. We say, okay, we have the cell, and then there's new possibilities that are around that, and we have a second cell. And then those cells become a number of other cells, and they diverge in certain ways, and at each step there's new things that become possible. When you design, we do the same kind of thing. We do not design one thing and then follow it all the way through. We try multiple different possibilities. Those open up new possibilities. And so when I think about the possibilities for the future, I do not think about one good and one bad, right? I think about many possibles in the future in one direction and many possibles maybe that are more tending towards the other direction, but there are many, and there are many steps. And this creates a whole set of opportunities for us as designers to differentiate coarsely between those two directions, but to understand there are many possible endpoints within those. Now, when I was a professor for many years teaching user experience, and one of the first things that students would do when they came into my class was they would say to me, "Am I doing it right?" And I'd always say to them, this is not a math problem, right? This is not about the right answer and the wrong answer. Because what they were really needing to understand, they need to make this shift between not was this good or bad, but was this better or was this worse? And once I could shift them into that way of thinking about things, then the question becomes, well, what constitutes better? What is the context? What is the environment? What is the perspective on which we would say that this better? Better for whom? Under what situation? Do we have the money to do it? What are the constraints which offer? Is this about the public good, about individual good? And then we have other questions about what becomes worse. And so I view it as much more complex and many more possibilities and pathways here. And the work that we do is about mapping those out and doing those adjacent possibles and trying to make some judgments to some extent about those. And feeling our way through this. I do not think it's as simple as.
Stephanie, last question to you. Just having listened to Matthias being very pessimistic and Karl being more optimistic, what is your observation with less virtual experiences? Are we going into the option way or more into the pessimistic way?
No, I think there's always more than one way. And for me, what is tricky, just to add to Karl's direction, is even when you ask if is it better or worse, is also the time frame that we easily forget. If it's better now, is it still going to be better it in 10 years, or the consequences of it in 10 years or 20 years or 100 years? I come from the Arab world. It's totally different framework, and I think, more or less all of us, the first reaction to the answer is, of course, cultural differences affect ethics, and of course, to a certain extent, they don't, because to a certain extent, to a certain extent of the human being, if you see it, some percentage is universal, some percentage is different, and diversity and cultural and all of that, and personal. People are different. But I think if we look at the part that is universal, then what is the ethical part attached to that? That should also be universal. And of course, it's not as easy as that, because for me, if you ask any American on the street, do they actually think that healthcare is not a human right? What is the popular? That's really, really strange.
Now, that is not everyone.
No, but
right?
You will find somebody that will agree with this approach.
It is not hard to find people who will tell you that, well, if you cannot afford to pay for healthcare, then you don't deserve healthcare.
Yeah. So for me, that's really, I would, with no blinking, consider that universal, but it's not. So it's always, the line is always kind of blurry. For me, just the approach, I think there is possibilities, because at every point you have a choice, and I think we always have a choice. And I'm more from the kind of practical side. We try the iterative approaches, and it's like evolution. Things were developed a lot. Some things survive, some things don't, and you learn from that, and you then keep developing, and you put the best intention and what you think works for people, and you engage them. It's not for them, it's with them.
Thank you very much for the moment here on the panel. Now it's your turn. Any questions, comments on it?
No. Silence.
There's one word I was hoping to hear when we talk about the user and the ethics, And for me, it's transparency. And I think we didn't really talk about that because sometimes it's not clear how much data on us is on the cloud. And I think for me, it plays into ethics because if I don't know, let's take an example. I go to the chiropractor and they're going to do something and they say, hey, this might hurt a bit, but it's going to help you in the long run. They're being transparent with me. But if you know, they just do it and I'm like, ow, what was that? You know, it changes the ethics of it. What's your take on transparency in your lines of work?
Well, for us, it's really simple. If you talk of a specific project and what we do on a day-to-day basis, things come from people. And what we do is when we go back to them, because of course the kind of refinement on this is we're also not creating for the individual human being. You have to always deal with more than one person. So where it becomes absolutely necessary to show how the process has evolved is how do we go from 4 people asking for 4 completely different things for 4 completely different reasons, and then we come back with actually a 5th thing. And that kind of thinking process and how we think that will help is extremely important to explain. We specifically don't hold any data. What we work with the patterns and the learnings. And that, for me, those are really important for learning for the next group of people.
May I just also add that I think that's what we talked about previously, in the sense that, again, I'm going to mention regulations, but to me, yeah, this is about actually this privacy initiative. That's when there is at least a way for user control of NC, because not only you can request the deletion of your data, but with initiative you can also request what kind of data a certain company holds on you, and then decide if you delete it or not. So maybe that's one way of solving this transparency thing.
You know, transparency to me is has a couple of different related words along with it, and I do not think that transparency is always what we desire. I think that we may, as a society, feel that yes, we need to make sure that things are transparent and that things are hidden. But things are transparent, they are not hidden, we can gain access to those kinds of things. But how many of you own an iPhone? I assume that most of you do. Would you consider the iPhone and the inner workings of that to be transparent? Right? I mean, Apple has built its reputation and its quality and its business around actually not so much hiding things, but making sure that there is a layer, right? There is a layer that is good for you, and there is stuff that is hidden you just simply do not need to know about. I actually studied physics and engineering physics when I was in university, and so we took things like, we studied quantum mechanics and like things all the way down to, in the computer, like, you know, putting electrons on the screen and all the transistors, and I learned to like lay out all the stuff in the transistors on the semiconductors, and it is now way, way more advanced than what I studied. Does that mean that we should all learn that kind of thing so that we can see the machine all the way down to that level? What do we mean by transparency here?
Yes.
I have a follow-up on exactly that point. What are the implications on us designers? Do we have to know do we have to know about machine learning? Do we have to know how algorithms work to be better designers?
Oh boy, okay, me again. Well, all right.
It doesn't have to be you. I mean, maybe.
All right, so in the world of design, there has been a debate for a number of years about whether or not designers should learn to code, right? How many of you feel that you can learn to code? You know how to code. What do you mean by code? Does meaning to code mean that you know JavaScript? Does it mean that you know C++? Do you know machine language? Can you do assembler on an i86 chip? Do you know those instruction sets, right? I mean, I remember taking those things many years ago, did assembly language on an old processor called the Z80 and other kinds of things. I have all long forgotten here, right? But we talk about learning to code as though that will make us better designers, but there are layers to this. This goes down really deep, and we have to understand how far down should we go. There's an old rule of thumb in programming that if you want to learn one language and get really good at it, suppose that it's Python, right? It's a language that I know. If you want to become really good, and I am not really good, I'm just okay, you should really learn how to be a C++ programmer or a C programmer. And if you want to be a really good C programmer, you need to move one level down. And so I would say my answer is that as designers, we do need to understand and identify what is the one layer down, but we do not need to go all the way down, because that way, well, it lies madness for one thing, but it is simply an inefficient way for us to go about doing our work. We need to think at least a level down, but we don't need to go 4 and 5 and 6 levels down.
Thank you. There's another question up there, and then here.
Yes, two of you guys are working for business, like business to business, I would say, like for the human resource, and the one with for the houses. So is there two ethics? One is on the business level, B2B. Are they different than the ones with B2C, for example, or consumer good stuff? Do you understand my question?
Are you
Two
asking if
different-
there is a difference between ethics in B2C and B2B?
Exactly.
I think there is more responsibility on the B2C side. That's my intuitive answer. Because you're exposed, like there's less time for reaction. You're as a user, you're exposed directly to the system you're interacting with. And also, I think you leave a larger trace, so to say, on the software. So I would say the B2C design, intuitively, to me, means more responsibility somehow. Because for B2B design, you always have more time to evaluate your choices. Like, for example, we cannot even properly do A/B tests because we just don't have enough traffic or just privacy data. It does not allow us that. Like in my previous company, we were actually forbidden to collect user data because that's companies using our software, not the end customer. So somehow, yes, I think the B2C ethics is even more dangerous, so to say, more specific, yeah.
We don't do a difference. It's we try to show the truth as comprehensive as possible, but customized to your personal needs, whatever your need is.
Sorry, maybe I can add something onto that. For me, the B2B doesn't stop at the B. It has to go to the C. Because, I mean, I also spoke about this. It's not about just what you're delivering. It's about many levels after what you deliver, what may or may not happen. And your B has C's. So if the responsibility is I mean, in one sense, except when we do private houses and private villas, when we're hired by a B. But if you stop there, then there's a whole chunk that is missing. So I would really look at it as at the end the same thing. If you look at the whole picture of.
But can I add to this?
Sure.
Isn't though you as a individual, you a little bit care about what trace you leave a bit more than when you're a company?
No, it's the same.
Because
I am the company, so I founded my company.
Right,
so
right.
for me, one of the many reasons I did that is to have choice, so I don't have to work for somebody else that has a different judgment, but also because we had a different approach. But for me, the trace is the trace. I don't care who's leaving it, it's the trace the problem.
But as an individual, you're affected more, because that's your private life.
But you're affecting others. And when you affect others, whether you're an individual or a company, it's the same.
Okay.
Sorry,
that's
my
it's a discussion.
that's my perspective on this. Yeah.
My question is more in a kind of like a philosophical world, so it's towards you, Matthias. Could the data ever replace the designer in a sense, like every design decision could be replaced by a crowdsource or democratized somehow? And if so, wouldn't we lose the kind of like new, fresh stuff that way?
I was facing this a lot in architecture, and it's the other way around. So with data and with nice data algorithms, what we get rid of is the boring stuff, this repetitive stuff we need to do for every project, and we can focus on generating new things. And with better data, we can find those pain points, we identify them much better, and then we set up experiments. We collect new data and we figure out, does it work out this way or not? What we do becomes much more meaningful because we can test it.